يا ابن أمي جارت الدنيا علينا يا أخي إنا من الأسر أتينا.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق نبينا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أصحابه المنتجبين وبعد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran Kareem, He says, وَكُلًّا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وَكُلًّا نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ من أنباء الرسل ما نثبت به فؤادك وجاءك في هذه الحق والموعظة وذكرى للمؤمنين. My intention in this talk is to reflect upon the power of the dream of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. It is to reflect upon the sublime motivations which inspired Imam Hussein alayhi salam and those with him to engage in a mission of sacrifice which has to this day preserved a vision of Islam which continues to inspire the Muslim Ummah, and in particular the lovers and followers of Ahlalbait Jongeren11-03-07. And the reason why I have chosen to reflect upon this dream, this vision of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, is because it is this dream which we as Muslims living in the West must revitalize, and we must transmit it to the societies in which we live. We live in a time when, after many centuries and many decades of there being a dream, a human dream of fulfillment, a desire on the part of politicians, on the part of even the culture of the West, to seek a dream for the fulfillment of all human beings, we have gone from that state of affairs to a state of affairs where all of the society is becoming more and more underpinned by fear rather than hope. So people are forced to think about everything in terms of fear. And this is because fear is the greatest guarantee of power and control. And without a dream of a society based upon virtue, a society in which the currency of generosity, of kindness, of patience, of magnanimity, of nobility, of knowledge, of wisdom, a society which doesn't have a currency for these things succumbs to the lowest common denominator, succumbs to bestiality, succumbs to criminality, succumbs to vice, resigns itself out of a fear, even for basic provision, to have to descend to these type of humiliations. And this is why Imam Hussein alayhi salam famous sayings, Hayhata min adillah. Imam Hussein alayhi salam says, it is better to die. It is better to die and sacrifice oneself for the sake of haqq, for the sake of the truth, than to live a life of humiliation. And the life of humiliation is that you and I resign ourselves to a fear of this world which leads us to compromise all of our virtues and values for the sake of our selfish interests and for the sake of our self-preservation. So this dream of Imam Hussein alayhi salam is the dream of Islam. And the dream of Islam is what we, you and I, are responsible for communicating here in the West. I often go to gatherings of young Muslims in various parts of the world, and I say to them, I ask them a very challenging question. I ask them, do you know what I mean when I say the American dream? And you should see how fast the hands go up. And I say, what is this American dream? And they tell me liberty, and they tell me democracy, and they tell me freedom, and they tell me the ability to earn a livelihood and to become wealthy. And they are fluent with the answer of what it is, what is this American dream. But then I ask them, what is the dream of Islam? And it's always very surprising to me the difference in the readiness to respond to the question. On the American dream, we all know. We have been conditioned by stories, we have been conditioned by films, we have been conditioned by music, we have been conditioned by these things to immediately understand what someone means when they say American dream, even if we can not necessarily articulate it in a coherent one sentence or two sentences, but we understand sort of almost subliminally, almost subconsciously what we mean. But when somebody says, what is the dream of Islam, I often find in my audiences a great deal of unsurety as to what we are talking about when we talk about the dream of Islam. And the reason why this is important is because in the West there is an understanding that the best way in which people communicate with other people is by sharing their stories and their dreams. And the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam is one in which this very important concept of a human beings, of a community, of a society maintaining and upholding a dream has been preserved by our community. And it is one which is so potent that if we can find the right cultural language in which to communicate it to the societies in which we find ourselves, we will have transmitted a huge treasure to them which they will take and they will absorb. But the cultural language is important. We have to accept and understand that living in the West, there is a different cultural language. It is not the same cultural language as a language which we know from our heritage and from our individual cultures, from wherever we may come from. So therefore, we have to learn and we have to adapt and tell the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in the cultural language of the time. And this is where it is important to reflect upon this verse of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَكُلًّا, and we have related to you the stories, the news, وَكُلًّا نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ مِنْ أَنْبَاءِ of all the messages, مَا نُثَبِّتُ بِهِ فُؤَادَكَ, so that your fu'ad, your heart, will become firm on the path of Iman. وَجَاءَكَ فِي هَذِهِ, and through these stories, truth. The truth has come to you through these stories. وَالْمَوْعِظَةِ, and counsel. وَذِكْرَى لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ, and reminder for the people of Iman. Now, we often talk about the Prophet ﷺ as being a statesman. We often talk about him as being a warrior. We often talk about him as being a legislator, a judge, a politician. But we neglect to realize that the first step that the Prophet ﷺ took was that of a storyteller. So much so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to him, فَقْصُصِ الْقَصَصَ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. He says to them, tell the people the stories so that they will reflect. Because the power of story has a deep-seated potency within the mind and the heart of a human being that if a story is told to them and transmitted to them, it would affect them in a way that other ways cannot affect them. This is the secret behind the entertainment industry and the media industry. It understands this. It understands the power of the story. And we should understand that this power of the story has been outlined to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. And indeed, it was the very technique which the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam used to begin the process of transforming his community. If you want to transform a people, a society, a community, the first thing you have to do is you have to change the story that that community tells itself. You have to revise the story that the pre-Islamic peoples were telling themselves were stories which were antithetical to Islam. So the Prophet ﷺ had to begin by telling them stories of virtue, stories which revitalized in them their humanity and their proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he told them these stories, but through the stories of the messengers, through the stories of the Rusul, through the stories of the Anbiya, but also through the stories of other wise people and servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who were neither messengers nor prophets. Because the important thing is the wisdom and the knowledge which are contained in these stories. So, I often say to my audiences, every advert that you see on television, every film, every song even that you might hear, all start off and how do they start off? They start out as a story on a page. And then those stories go through various processes to make them more assimilable and absorbable to their audience, and they're delivered in that way in order to set or mold the characters and the aspirations of people. So this is why the American culture, the popular culture, is so powerful, because they understand this technology of the human being. That the more stories you feed a human being, the more that you control the stories which a human being tells himself or herself, you will control him or her. And you can almost dictate, without even the visible appearance of power, you can dictate how they're going to act, what clothes they're going to want to wear, what trainers they're going to want to wear, what games they're going to want to play. All through the simplicity of the story. And this is the cultural language which we are dealing with in today's world. And this is where the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, this is how we must employ the story alayhi salam to transform ourselves first and foremost, but to transform our societies. Now, the medium is very important. I talked about how important it is to adapt to the cultural context of the time and place in which we're living. And to give you an example, during the time of Nabi Allah Musa alayhi salam, can anyone here tell me what the cultural language of the time of Nabi Musa alayhi salam was? Anyone? Not the linguistic language, the cultural language. What was the cultural language of the time? Magic. The cultural language of the time of Nabi Musa alayhi salam was magic. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did what? He did not send Nabi Musa alayhi salam with a PowerPoint presentation to explain to him the message of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Nabi Musa alayhi salam with something which appeared to be magic, but it transcended magic. It was above magic. Therefore, when the magicians threw down their staffs and they appeared to be snakes, theirs was not real snakes, but Nabi Musa alayhi salam was higher and was able to subsume or consume their snakes. So this shows you the importance of using the cultural language of the time to communicate effectively to people. In the time of Nabi Isa alayhi salam, what was the cultural language? Anyone tell me what the cultural language of Nabi Isa alayhi salam was? Anyone? Mu'jiza, healing and miracles. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not send him with magic. He sent him with healing and miracles. because that was the language of the people of the time, and that is what they would be able to understand and assimilate and absorb. In the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what was the cultural language? Literature, poetry. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends the Quran in the very rajas meter which was conversable to the people of the time. So we as Muslims, as followers and lovers of Ahlalbait Jongeren11-03-07, in this time, we have to find the cultural language through which not only to tell ourselves a story effectively, because we will only be as good as how effective we are in transmitting the story of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, indeed the stories of the Imma and of the messengers, but also in order to share this story with the wider society. We have to use the cultural language of the time. And the cultural language of the time are a number of things, but crucially, what is it? What is the cultural language of today? Film, media, multimedia is cultural language of the time. So far in the West, and we have to admit this with humility, we have not been successful at communicating the story of Imam Hussain alayhi salam to the wider society in the cultural language of the time, and then we are surprised at why we are not so easily understood by the people. Of course, they do not understand. They cannot understand the cultural language through which we appreciate this story. And indeed, we will find, as we get to the third generation and fourth generation, less and less will our very youngsters of our society understand in the way in which we understand. And I think you will already appreciate this fact, that the way in which the older generation understand the story of Imam Hussain alayhi salam is gradually changing in your generation. You need to understand it in a different way, in a different context. So this is the challenge. The future of Islam, and indeed the future of Europe and the future of Islam are inextricable. Because as a result of the falling birth rates in European countries, it will be you and your later generations who will be the workers and the developers of Western, of European society. But you will only be as good as how effective you have been in transmitting and sharing these value systems, these virtues, these prophetic virtues which make up these stories of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and the stories of the messengers and the Anbiya. So we have a great responsibility. We have a great responsibility for ourselves to understand and to internalize these stories and begin to express them culturally in a way which will inspire us, to transform, because the deen is nothing without transformation. The deen is nothing without a gradual progression from shadow to light. The deen is about illumination and inspiration. It is about absorbing knowledge, not knowledge as facts and figures that you derive from a book, but knowledge as light. Imams alayhi salam tell us that knowledge is light which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala casts into the hearts of whomsoever He wills. This is the approach that we must have to in our relationship with this dream of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. That we must see ourselves as representative of this vision, representatives of this dream, and we must be illuminated by the same motivations which illuminate Imam Hussain alayhi salam. To be noble, to be generous, to reflect in our character the attributes and the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we are told by Imam alayhi salam, takhallaqu, that you have to have takhalluq. You have to go through the process of molding your character according to the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We may have difficulty in developing taqwa, in developing conscience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so close to us. When something is so close, it's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so far, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so close to us that we find it difficulty to witness. But Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says, مَا رَأَيْتُ شَيْئًا إِلَّا وَرَأَيْتُ اللَّهَ قَبْلَهُ وَبَعْدَهُ وَمَعَهُ. I have not seen a thing except I have seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before it, with it, and after it. This is the state of mind, of consciousness of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. This is how a man can go with his family and his companions and face death and face the ultimate sacrifice with absolute serenity and contentment because of that consciousness, because of that proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being so immediate and so real and so palpable that in fact everything else diminishes and everything else wanes in relation to that consciousness. This is the consciousness which we must attain. This is the taqwa which we must attain. But that taqwa will only be available to us to the degree that we are effective in transmitting and absorbing these stories of wisdom, these stories of knowledge, these stories of sublime character. As Prophet ﷺ said, Islam husnul khulq. That Islam, entirety of Islam is good character. This is the simplicity, profound simplicity of Islam. Is that the entirety of Islam has to do with you and I's willingness and ability to adorn ourselves with the characteristics of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't want to be of this dunya. We want to be in this dunya, but we want not to be of this dunya. We want to reflect the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of our words, in all of our characters, in all of our actions. And this is why another thing which is important is the Asma'ul Husna. That you and I learn the Asma'ul Husna. This is very important. I always say to the young people, if you don't know the Asma'ul Husna, you must learn them, and you must repeat them, and you must call on them. Because by calling on these Asma'ul Husna, you will bring out latent potential, you will actualize the latent potential in yourself, and you will realize it in your character and in your words. And indeed, in the very famous hadiths, Prophet ﷺ says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has 99 names. Whosoever learns them and internalizes them, dakhala al-Jannah. They will enter into Jannah. But what? Jannah in this world is a state of consciousness. This is what we must understand. Allah, in the surah that we have recited by the brother, Ya ayyatuha nafsul mutma'inna irji'i ila rabbiki radiyatan maradiyah fadkhuli fi ibadi wadkhuli jannati. I'm here to tell you that it is possible for you and I in this world to inhabit a state of consciousness which is of Jannah, of a Jannati quality. This is what we must understand. This is how the Imams alayhim wasalam lived. We cannot talk about the Imams alayhim wasalam as being these tremendous characters unless we are willing to emulate them, not only in their outer state but also in their inner condition. If the Imam alayhim wasalam were seen before Salah and their colors were changing and their hal, their state, and as they were approaching their Salah was such humility and such khushu and such devotion, then we have to emulate those characteristics. Because that is where power is in Islam. Power in Islam comes from light. Power in Islam comes from patience. If you look in all of the ayahs of the Quran which have to do with jihad and mujahada, you will find the most common attribute associated with the mujahid is patience. Not power, not bravery, not strength, not charisma. إِن يَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ مِئَةٌ صَابِرٌ يَغْلِبُوا مِئَتَيْنِ. If there are 100 patient among you, you will overcome 200. So these qualities, these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the blueprints. They are like the blueprints in our... Think of them as logos. I often go when I go to schools and I talk to young Muslim children, I say to them, I do a Nike swoosh on a blackboard and I say, what is this? And immediately they say Nike. And then I do an Audi, see the circle of the Audi car, and they can guess them so quickly. But then I start writing the names of Allah, and there's very few people who know what they are. Whereas these are the logos, these are the brand values of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These names of Allah are the brand values. So what I'm trying to impart to you is that Imam Hussain alayhi salam's dream is a comprehensive lifestyle. A comprehensive lifestyle of devotion to a higher reality and to the actualization of latent potential within ourselves, which will drive us into the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, regardless of the tribulation and the affliction. You know, regardless of tribulation, because tribulation and affliction are reality that all of us will have to deal with. You know, tribulation, affliction, and adversity are realities which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses to develop our iman. So we will be constantly confronted with tribulation. But the degree to which we will be able to deal with that affliction and tribulation will be down to the state of our hearts and the content of our hearts. We have to free our hearts of everything besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In order to be Hussaini, we have to free our hearts of all that is other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is ikhlas. That is the sincerity of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. So, yes, we must mourn, we must shed tears in the remembrance of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, but we must be transformed by that message. That every commemoration of Imam Hussain alayhi salam leads to a greater transformation of ourselves, so that we are becoming more and more nurani, more and more light, more and more radiant, more and more luminescent. And let me tell you, nur is also energy. Aura, the word in English, aura. Nur is also aura. Light is something that can be felt by people even if they don't know what it is. We have to have confidence in that. If we don't have confidence in that nur, that it is an energy, that it is a light, that even though it's not seen by the eyes, it can be felt by people, then we have nothing. The deen is nothing without that light. But if you have the confidence and the iman in that light, then anything is possible. Anything is achievable. Anything can be overcome. إِن يَنْصُرُكُمُ اللَّهُ فَلَا غَالِبَ لَكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala assists you with this light, فَلَا غَالِبَ لَكُمْ, there's nothing that can overwhelm you. Yazid did not overwhelm Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Only in the relation to what you might perceive as being physical, you might say that, but the physical is such a small, minute aspect of the entirety of existence. What do we know about the invisible matter of which the universe is made? Majority of the universe is invisible dark matter of which we have. What do we know about that? Because the ghaib is more important. The ghaib is more important. The person of iman, more of himself or herself is in the ghaib than it is in this world. This is why Imam Ali alayhi salam, he used to say, Saluni, Saluni, qabla an tafqaduni. Ask me for you. I am more knowledgeable about the sama, about that which is transcendent, than I am about this earth of yours. Because a mu'min busies himself only in this earth with only as much as he needs to move on to the akhirah. The dunya is like a transition place for the akhirah. It's not something to busy you. In the story of Nabi Allah Dawood alayhi salam, when they are crossing the river, he says, those of you will be with me who do not drink from the water in the river, إِلَّا مَنِ اخْتَرَفَ غُرْفَةً بِيَدِهِ, except for that person who takes one handful of water. The meaning of that story is, you need only engage in this dunya to the degree which you require in order to move on to the akhirah. And those who drunk from the water, in this story, the water is symbolism of the dunya. Those who drunk from that water, only a ghurfa, or didn't drink at all, they were the people of Dawood alayhi salam. And look what happened. Kam min fi'atin qalila, ghalabat fi'atin kathira bi'idhnillah. How many a small force can overwhelm a large force? Because the nur. because the nur is infinitely more powerful than this dark shadow world of the material and the physical. And this is why self-knowledge is important. This is why self-knowledge is important. To be a follower and lover of Ahlalbait Jongeren11-03-07, you have to engage in the ma'rifah of nafs. You have to engage in the knowledge of yourself, which will lead you to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And only when you have the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will you be able to have the knowledge of even Imam Hussein alayhi salam. In the famous hadith, and the famous dua of the Aimah alayhi salam, Allahumma arifni nafsak, فَإِن لَمْ تُعَرِّفْنِي نَفْسَكَ لَمْ أَعْرِفْ نَبِيَّكَ. This is very important, and this is something we get the wrong way around. Oh Allah, give me the knowledge of yourself, because if you do not give me the knowledge of yourself, I cannot know your prophet. And then, Allahumma arifni nabiyak. Oh Allah, give me the knowledge of your prophet. فَإِن لَمْ تُعَرِّفْنِي نَبِيَّكَ. If you do not give me the knowledge of it, لَمْ أَعْرِفْ. I cannot know waliya. I cannot know his wali. So there is a succession, there is a sequence of knowledge, of the acquisition of knowledge, which we must acknowledge. And it begins with knowledge of yourself, which leads, as Imam Ali alayhi salam says, "Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbuhu." So whoever knows himself, he will come to know his Lord, which will lead you to knowledge of Allah, and then you will begin to appreciate, truly appreciate the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Naim alayhi salam. They are indicators to that higher knowledge, that we have to go from the right way around. And this is where self-knowledge, and just before I end, I'll tell you a story about self-knowledge, which is give you an appreciation now related to Imam Hussein alayhi salam and Yazid. Very simple story. There was a man, an ignoramus. He was used to living in the wilderness, and he did not usually associate with people and engage with people. And one day he found himself in a huge city where there were throngs and throngs and multitudes of people. And he was so confused and bewildered by this, by being around so many people. He thought to himself, as the night was coming, that if I was to fall asleep in this city with all these people around me, the next morning when I awake, I won't know which of them I am. Such was his confusion. So he thought, how can I avoid this catastrophe of losing myself amongst all these people? So he took a squash, a vegetable, and he tied it to his leg, thinking that if I tie this squash to my leg, tomorrow morning when I wake up, I will know who I am by the fact that I have this squash tied to my leg. So he goes to sleep. Now there happened to be an inhabitant of that town who was an intelligent, spiritually intelligent person, and he was witnessing this person's strange actions. So he waited till he went to sleep, and he took the squash off his leg and he tied it to his own leg, and he himself also went to sleep. And when the next morning came, the ignorant person woke up. And of course, the first thing he did was try to find out who he is by the fact that he had a squash tied to his leg. And of course, the squash was not on his leg. So he went into even further confusion until he saw the squash tied to the other person's leg. And he thought to himself, this must be me. And he started to remonstrate and scream at the man, if you are me, who am I and where am I? And this is a very simple story to impress upon us the importance of self-knowledge. That if we do not have self-knowledge, we will take all sorts of things and we will append them to ourselves in order to find identity. Our language, our ethnicity, our profession, our wealth, our neighborhoods, our reputations, even our bodies, even our physical bodies, even the ego, in order to find some security in the sense of identity. But the person who has knowledge of himself doesn't need any of these things, because he or she knows that they are ruh, that their primary identity is the ruh that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحٍ, and I breathe into him my spirit. Without this ruhaniyat, without this spirituality, you will not come to an accurate understanding of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, because you will not be able to appreciate where he was coming from. You will not be able to appreciate his motivations. You will not be able to appreciate his worldview. This is crucial. And also you will not be able to ascend to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to the knowledge of the messengers, your knowledge of them will be very superficial and be very historical, but it will not be real and spiritual and have depth. So this is what Imam Hussein alayhi salam, the vision of Imam Hussein alayhi salam was that people, there will be a society which is based upon this knowledge of what was real. Whereas Yazid wanted a society based upon people tying all sorts of things to their legs so that they could be bought and sold as he desired. So they could be bought and sold for reputation. So they could be bought and sold for influence. They could be bought and sold for clan allegiance. So they can be bought and sold. But if you are ruh, you cannot be bought and sold. If you are like hur, you cannot be bought and sold. You are free. You are in true emancipated and free and liberated from the confines of this dunya. As the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ad-dunya sijnul mu'min." The dunya is the prison of the person of iman. Wa jannatul kafir, and it is the paradise of the people of denial of kufr. This is a whole completely different paradigm. This is what we have to understand. You cannot have the same worldview. If the dunya is a decision for you, it's a different from worldview from a person for whom the dunya is a paradise. And this is why Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Imam Ali alayhi salam says, qatl, to die as a shaheed is better for me than dying in bed. And he says, Fuztu bi Rabbil Kaaba. I have, when he was being, he says, I have won. I have victory is mine. So my brothers and sisters in Iman, it behooves us, it is very important for us to appreciate the power of the vision and the dream of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And that dream inspire us to create communities in which virtue is the common currency, in which currency of virtue is more important than the currency of the guilder or the pound or the dollar, is more important than dunya aspirations, is more important than reputation, is more important than ego. This is the message of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, that it is worth dying for the upholding of such a society than it is to resign to the status quo of the lowest common denominator, that everyone has a price, and if you pay that price, you can buy them, and you can humiliate them, and you can cause them to be abased and indignant. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله.